Hi guys, and you're very welcome back. Now in the last lesson we set up the foundations of what is our Rapid app, and we're going to continue on now building this Rapid app in this lesson. So what are we going to do in this lesson? Well, in this lesson we're going to create a model for our staff or for our users. So as I mentioned in the previous lesson, we're building a feedback tool. So if you're working in a company, you can leave feedback for a colleague. So our users are going to be staff. In Rails, when creating an application, typically the first step when creating a new web app is to create a data model. A data model is a representation of the structure needed by our application. Now, as I've just said, for this Rapid app, we will create an employee performance system with only staff names and feedback and a rating. So nice and simple, but enough to keep us going. We'll start by creating a model for employees or our users or staff, whichever way you want to call them. And then we'll add a model for the feedback and for the ratings. To keep moving along, this application will have no styling. We'll look at CSS and HTML in future lessons. This app will also have no password or login requirement, which again we'll look at in future lessons. So our app will have the following: a unique identifier or an ID, a publicly viewable name, an email address, which is also a username, a job role, and a feedback rating. And what will that look like? Well, if I just type it out here for you, so let's have a look here. Let's just go File and New, so New File. So what will that be? Well, our users are going to consist of, so this would be our user table if you think about it as a database. So we're going to have an ID, which is going to be an integer. Then we're going to have a name, and a name is of course a string. After that, we're going to have an email. An email again is a string. After that, we'll have a job role, as I mentioned. Role, there we go. Tab that, and that is also going to be a string. So these four attributes here will compose our users. And as I've just mentioned, our app will have the ability for an employee or a user to leave feedback. The feedback model consists of the following. So what will our feedback look like? Feedback, and that's going to look like this. We're going to have an ID, which again is going to be an integer. We're going to have content. So if you wanted to leave in a few words like, you know, Tony is a great employee, and that's going to be text. We're going to have a rating. So if you wanted to give that employee a rating out of 1 to 5 or whatever it might be, so we're going to say that that's an integer. And finally, we're going to have a user ID. And that will be an integer again. Integer. So each piece of feedback will need to be associated with an employee. We do this by recording the user ID of the owner of the feedback. We'll see in later lessons how this user ID attribute allows a user to have many associated pieces of feedback. But for the moment, we'll implement the user's data model along with a web interface. This combination of model and interface creates what we call a user's resource. So as we're building the user section, it's called the user's resource. If we were doing the feedback, it would be called the feedback resource. The user's resource allows us to think of users as objects that can be created, read, updated, and deleted, all via the web interface. And as mentioned earlier, our user's resource will be created by a scaffold generator program. At this stage, don't get too bogged down by the code generated with the scaffold command. Simply follow along and we will get into more depth later on. So to generate Rails scaffolding, we use the Rails generate script. We then pass an argument to this script, which is the name of the resource we want to create. So as we said, users. So let's do that now. So let's pop open terminal. And here it is prepared earlier. So I'm in, as you can see here, my Rapid app. So the command we use is Rails generate scaffold. And as I just said, we're creating the user resource. So that's going to be user with a capital U, very important. So what's going to be in this resource? Well, if you look here just on the left hand side of my terminal, I have ID, name, email, and job role. So how are we going to put them into our user's resource? Well, we do the following. So we have name, which we said was a string. So here we are, name separated by a colon, string, space. Then we have email, which again we said was a string. So colon, string, space. Job underscore role. Role, is role a word? I don't know. Role, there we go. And we said that that's going to be a string. So 3 strings. So let's just look at that one more time before I hit enter. Rails generate scaffold. So the Rails generate command. And we're going to generate scaffolding. We're creating the user's resource. So later on when we create the feedback resource, this word here will obviously be feedback with a capital F. Then we started to add in pieces of our web interface or attributes of what a user will be. So we have name separated by a colon, which is a string. We have email, which again is a string. And we have job role, which is a string, all separated by colons. So let's hit enter and see what happens. So it's gone off to think about it, and let's let that run for a moment. Okay, so as you can see, a lot of new files have been created. So for any eagle-eyed students now, you might have noticed that we did not include a parameter for ID. And why is that? Because this is created automatically by Rails for use as a primary key in databases. So as we mentioned before, Rails takes care of a lot of the work for you. So we've created our user resource, and what do we need to do now? Our next step is to migrate the database, because we have created a database which will be storing our users. So that will be a place for a name, a place for email address, a place for job role. And how do we do that? We say Rails db : migrate. Enter. Again, let it think about it. Let's see what we get back. Okay, perfect. Created a users table. So the Rails db command will update the database with our new users data model. Again, try not to get too bogged down on what we're doing here. There'll be plenty of explanations on database migrations in future lessons. Simply follow along and do the best you can. This lesson and the one before and the few to come are all about rapid application development. Let's now run our local web server. So I already have it running here, so here you go. So let me refresh this. Where is it? Refresh. And it says hello world. Okay, were we expecting something else? Well, you might be expecting here to see something related to the users, because that's what we just did. But what we did was we created a users resource. So let's see here. If I go /users, give it a second to think about it. And there we go. A very simple interface for users. So as you can see here, we have a heading, users, name, email, and job role. And you might notice here again, our eagle-eyed students, the underscore from job role has been removed. So we have a few URLs here that we're able to access. So obviously /users gives us the index, which is a page to list all our users. We have new here, and if I click new, let's see what that URL is. Users /new. Perfect. Let's add in a user while we're here. Tony Staunton. What's my email address? My email is tony@example.com. What's my job role? My job role is the boss. And you can see here Rails has created a button for us as well, create user. Okay, excellent. What URL are we at now that we have successfully created a user? We are at users /1. So this is the page to show a user with the ID 1. Now if we had 50 users in here, we could go to users /39, 40, whatever it might be. Let's go back. So here we are again on our users homepage, /users, and you can see Tony Staunton and all the information I entered in here. Again, if I click new user, /new, but I don't want to do that right now, so let's go back. These buttons up here, which have automatically been created by Rails, what do they do? Well, one obviously shows us our information, and that's /1. Let's go back. One edits. So /users /1 /edit. So I think you start to get the message. So we could edit this in here, and let's say I don't want to be the boss. That seems a bit mean, I suppose, or a bit big-headed. I don't know. Let's say, I don't know, manager. Update user. User was successfully updated. Perfect. Let's go back. As you can see, my job role here has been updated. And then finally we have destroy, so I could delete myself if I wanted. And then down the bottom, new user. So amazing. With a few simple commands, the Rails generate scaffold command and the Rails db migrate command, we have created a user's resource with a full-on web interface. And not only a web interface, several pieces of functionality such as show, edit, destroy, and new user. Very, very impressive with a very simple piece of code. And now you get as well why I've called this section the Rapid App, because we have rapidly created an application with very little knowledge of Ruby on Rails. Okay guys, so that's great. A little bit of code, but a lot to show for it. Now in the previous lesson we discussed the Rails MVC architecture. Now that we've created a simple app and have it up and running, let's revisit this. Let's discuss it in the context of a browser hit. So here we are now on our application's index page, and how do we know we're on the index page? Because we're simply at our URL, which is localhost 3000 /users. So that's the user's index page. Now, if I just go to Google here and I just Googled Rails MVC, you will get all sorts of information here. So I'll just pop open the first one here, sitepoint.com, understanding the model view controller architecture in Rails. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down here, and this is exactly what we have now running, but this is it explained in diagram form. So we have a browser which issues a request for the user's URL, so our user's URL. So as you can see here, that's part 1. And what happens next is Rails routes the users to the index action in the user's controller. So we have our application logic here. So that's what's happening exactly right now. Rails is routing /users to the index action in the user's controller. The index action asks the user model to retrieve all users. So that's here. So this piece of business logic here. So as we mentioned in the previous lesson, the model is where our data is held. So when I say the index action asks the user model to retrieve all users, what's happening here is when we type in the URL /users, Rails is going off to the model, and if there's any users, it's going to display them on the index. If not, it will just display a blank page. That's what's happening here. Gather data and update. So any data that has to be showed on the index, go and get it. And next what it does, when it has that data, it goes back through the controller and renders a view. That view is then sent back to the browser and shown to you and me as the users. So let's just recap this one more time. So here we are here. So we start out with a URL that we type in to a web browser. And that can be either typed in or we could be clicking a link. Having received this request, the Rails router sends a request to the proper controller action based on the URL. So as we know, this is going to our user's controller. Let's take a look at the code that creates the mapping of user URLs to controller actions for the user's resource. And that's in the following location. Let's pop open our Atom here and let's go to config. So here we are here, config. And you can see here that config is highlighted as a kind of orange color, as is the main folder, and routes. That means that we have changes that we have not yet committed to Git, but don't worry about that, we'll get to that later. Now let's click on our routes. So as you can see here, resource users. So Rails is automatically from our Rails generate scaffold command added in the user's resource here for us. Perfect. So this code creates all the URLs we just looked at a moment ago. So when I say all the URLs, I mean users, I mean /1, the delete, the back, all those ones there. That code creates all these URLs, the show URL, the edit URL, all the URLs we just went through a moment ago. So just one thing to note here on the piece of code that Rails automatically inserted for us, :users is a symbol. It's what's called in Rails a symbol, and we'll explore that in a future lesson. While here, let's associate the root with the user's index. And what does that mean? This means that the slash goes to /users. So instead of going here, so when we just type in our base URL, which is localhost, there we go. What we want to do now is go to our users resource, /users. We don't want to have to type this in, we're too lazy. Let's change this to make it a little bit easier for ourselves. And we did something like this in a previous lesson. So again, we want to use the index action in the user's controller, which we can do with the following. So let's go back into Atom, and here we are here. So instead of saying root application hello, what we want to say is root, let me just delete this here. What we want to say is root users hash symbol index. There we go. And let me save that. Now let's see what happens now if I go back into my web browser and I simply type in localhost. Hopefully this works. This is all live, you just never know. There you go. Excellent. That's pretty handy. So now instead of having to go localhost 3000 /users, we simply type localhost 3000 and it brings us to this URL, the index page of our users. Okay guys, that's it for this lesson. I hope all of that made sense. If not, please feel free to contact me in the community or the Q&A section of this lesson. And obviously you can watch this lesson over and over again as many times as you need to until it makes sense. And if it still doesn't make sense, then ask me questions anyway. I'm always ready to answer them. In the next lesson, we're going to look at exactly what is a controller. We're also going to look at some more URLs that controller actions can generate. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next lesson.